The last few years have had dramatic changes in what we see with racing footwear for road racing, mainly, is where the focus has been. In 2017, Nike came up with a shoe that changed the course of what racing footwear would be like. So let's start with a little bit of general ideas on running footwear. First, let's take a look at this conversation. If you've been a runner or you're in an exercise science program or something like that, you may have had a conversation something like this before, where someone comes and asks you, what kind of shoe should I wear? I want to start a running program. And it's not quite that simple. We can't just say, here's the shoe that you need. You need a bit more information. There should be a purpose behind every run that we do. So you might find that you have somebody that is just interested in general health and fitness, and they want to get a running program going to help them live a good, healthy life. In that case, there may just be one shoe that's needed. One like the blue one that you see there is a good, just all-purpose running shoe, some protection for the feet. Not going to be the fastest shoe that you could race in, but that wouldn't be the purpose. If you have someone that's interested in finishing a marathon someday, then most of their running would be in that shoe. If they want to go a little bit quicker, then they might get one like that white one, the 199 gram one that it shows there. If it's someone that's really wanting to get in and do a lot of racing, some of it on the track maybe, some of it on the road, they might need the whole collection of shoes that you see here. They each have their own purpose. If you think of the barefoot option, that's going to do some good things for strengthening the feet. It won't be the best for racing for most people, or maybe all, but it will do some things with strengthening the feet. If it's a day where you had a really hard workout one day, lower legs, feet are a bit beat up, then you still might have a run the next day, what we call a recovery run. But if the feet are kind of beat up, you might want to shoe like the Hoka that's up there in red and green. That one has a lot of extra cushioning, a lot of protection for the feet, and that might be a good one to recover in. For racing, it might be spikes for the track, or the 199 gram shoe might be a good option if it's going for something on the road. So ask follow-up questions. If someone wants to know what kind of shoe should I buy, then there'll be some time that you need to have a little conversation, figure out what's the purpose of each run that you would be completing. Now, quite a few years ago, Ben O'Nig, who is a researcher up at the University of Calgary, he went through a very long, decades-long career with a big focus on running footwear and injury and a bit with performance. One of his final articles that he got published before he retired was about this preferred movement path, where the foot naturally wants to move in a certain way so that there's not too much pressure under certain areas of the foot. If it's barefoot, it's difficult to land comfortably, so we adjust our foot strike in that case. If we have a shoe that has a bit too much of an arch for our purposes, then as we run through, we might adjust to try to take pressure off that area. So the idea that Benno had is if we can find a shoe that is comfy for us and allows us to move the way our foot naturally wants to go, that's the one that will be best for injury risk and best for performance outside of other factors like weight of the shoe and so on. So if we can find a shoe that'll allow us to move in this preferred pattern that our foot likes, where it's protected in certain ways with not any high pressure in certain areas, that's going to be most likely the best shoe for our performance and minimal injury risk. And that's where the new style of racing shoes came along. The main purpose initially was for marathons. There was a athlete, Eliud Kipchoge, that was incredible, world record holder. And he was part of the development of this new shoe that Nike came up with called the Vaporfly. And the idea that Nike had behind this, with some marketing and so on, was, can we get someone to run a marathon in under 2 hours? So they designed these shoes with a stiff carbon fiber plate inside. Here's an example of one of the modern ones where it's very hard to bend here. The plate in there is a few layers of carbon fiber, so it doesn't flex as much. It has very thick foam compared to what was traditionally used, like the top and middle shoe that you see there, or what had been shoes that raced the world record prior. The Vaporfly is the one that you see on the bottom there. Much thicker foam. It was very low density and easy to squash. It stores and releases energy very easily. So the other part that goes into this is, since the foam is so thick, there's some options for the front shape of the shoe. We call this the toe spring, and that can be much more pronounced with these modern shoes because the foam is so much thicker approaching that area. So those are the characteristics of some of these new style of road racing shoes. I took some stats online. Hopefully all these numbers are correct. You never know exactly what you're going to get when you get on a web search, but according to various sites on the internet, here are a bunch of different what we call current super shoes these days, matched with some traditional racing shoes. And you'll notice in the yellow that I put down there at the bottom, there are some dramatic differences. The stack height, or height of the foam under the heel, is 95% thicker under the heel, and you'll notice the volume of the shoe's midsole is 95% larger than the traditional racing shoes that were used. There's also a very much higher stack height there under the heel, and the energy return is really high. When you store and release energy in this foam, it gives back a lot. So most of the numbers there you see are dramatically larger for volume and height, but on the left there, you see one of the values, the mass, is only 12% greater for this shoe, which is so much thicker and larger in volume, but the foam's such a low density that compared to those older ones that are much thinner, it's just a little bit more massive. For every 100 grams of shoe mass, typically it's somewhere around 1% greater energy cost for running, measured by oxygen uptake. So they're not much heavier, but have a whole lot more foam there that's very responsive and effective at returning the energy. A few years ago, we got a shipment from Saucony. Here's my friend Jared Ward on the treadmill demonstrating or showing off the shoes. We received these for a study. Jared runs for Saucony. He was one of our BYU Cougars that went on to compete professionally, got 6th place in the Olympics in the marathon in Rio, and helped us get a connection with Saucony. So we're able to do a lot of testing on what we call super shoes. This is the first version of what Saucony came up with for their super shoes. And the big difference is the effectiveness of storing and releasing energy. There's an altered mechanical advantage. When you think about the stiffness of the shoe with that plate, as we roll the foot forward, if it doesn't flex as much, we bring forward the center of pressure under the foot. So we're going to have a different torque placed around the ankle, different lever system or mechanical advantage, which will change something. At the time, we didn't know if that was better or worse, but it will change the mechanical advantage of the foot to the ground. And they're also very lightweight for the size that they have. So those are some of the benefits. How much does it help though? In 2017, that's when the Nike Vaporfly came out that you see in this image. There was a study by Walter Hoekhammer and Roger Crum and some others at Colorado where they tested the metabolic benefit. So using oxygen uptake measures, they found the Vaporfly would be about 4% less energy when running compared to the traditional racing shoes. They even named the shoe the 4%. So it's the Nike Vaporfly 4% based upon the energy savings. Now that doesn't mean they're going to be 4% faster, but it does mean they'll be able to use less energy as they run. These numbers were confirmed by Barnes and also one of the studies we did in our lab where we were seeing anywhere from around 3 to 4%. So really effective in these shoes. It made for some exciting changes going on. The image that you see here is from October 2017, just after the shoes had been released, but they were so new and so desirable that most people couldn't get a hold of them. We'd been able to round up a collection of sizes for our study, and my friend John Cotter and I were the only two on that start line that year that had these Vaporfly shoes. And as we're mingling with our competitors, getting ready, warming up and so on for the race, they noticed the shoes and they're asking all these questions about, oh, so do they really work and so on. And I was able to honestly tell them, yeah, and one person, it even showed 6% benefit. So we were kind of talking them up, trying to get in the heads of our competitors a little bit and make it a little bit fun for us and maybe add some anxiety to their race day. And the shoes worked great. John and I both had really good races that day. And that's the last time, or the first time, that I raced in Supershoes, is what we often call them. And I'll never do a race in anything other than some form of Supershoe, and they'll continue to grow and progress as we go through the years. So here's Jared as he was about to cross the finish line in Rio with his success there. And as we transitioned to Supershoes, we took a look at the changes that were going on and how effective they were, and whether we can find ways to improve them within the current rules. So in Rio, Jared was actually just wearing the Saucony Type A, which was one of those traditional racing shoes, while he was going up against a lot of competitors that were using the prototypes of that Vaporfly shoe. But he still had a great day. And in 2017, he was able to start racing in the super shoes that his sponsor, Saucony, was able to produce. So the Monday prior to the New York City Marathon, which is one of the world major marathons, enormous numbers, but the elite field is up there with one of the best in the world for any of the marathons around the world. A set of shoes similar to this one showed up. This is one of those shoes that appeared on Monday, race week. And they just sent him a collection of 3 different pairs of these prototypes to have him try sometime. Not necessarily with any thought of him actually racing in them, because they weren't fully developed yet. But as we looked at them, and Jared got excited about maybe these will be better than what I was planning on racing, we decided to do the Wednesday workout, which prior to marathon day is 4 times a mile at race pace with a 2-minute recovery. So we decided to have him do that on the treadmill in the lab while we measured his oxygen uptake, rather than doing it on the track, which was more typical for us. So he tried the Kinvara shoe that he was going to race in his original plan first, measured the oxygen uptake while he did one of his miles at race pace, then 2-minute break to change shoes, and we just went through the other collections. And we found the first 3 shoes that he wore, no difference, exactly the same energy cost in running. And then he put on the 4th pair that was like this, and all of a sudden the energy cost dropped by 2.5%. So he got off the treadmill. I told him the numbers. He got really excited about that and told Spencer at the headquarters for Saucony he's going to race in this shoe. And Spencer said, "Jared, I don't know if that shoe will even hold together for a whole marathon. You might want to think about that for your next one." But it was so effective. And as he kind of looked and tugged on it and did one other run in it before race day, he decided he'd just go for it. So gets on the start line, runs the race. Not everyone's wearing super shoes yet, other than the Nike athletes. And he's coming around the final turn, feeling a bit tired, but having a good day, looks over his shoulder and he sees Scott Fauble coming up behind him, who was in 2nd place as out of the Americans. Jared was currently in 6th place overall. And as he goes through that final finish stretch, knowing Scott Fauble looked like he was coming on quickly, he was thinking, I've got 6th place wrapped up as long as I stay ahead of Scott. And if I stay in this position, my top American bonus is $25,000. If Scott catches me, I'm going to only get $15,000 for that bonus. So a lot of his motivation in the end of that race was money. And he was able to hold off Scott, who ended up just 4 seconds behind him. So we started calling these his $10,000 shoes, because we're sure that if he's saving 2.5% energy while running, it's got to be well more than 4 seconds difference that he was saving there by racing in that shoe. So that made it exciting for figuring out how good super shoes are. And over the years, more development happened. This is the 2nd generation shoe that they came up with, which had a little bit of improvement. It was mostly the top that changed to be a bit lighter than the original. And then a few years later, a shoe kind of like this. This is the final one, but the prototype came in that had the same foam that you see here. And it was really effective. We brought it in the lab and Jared tried it out, and we were seeing numbers that we'd think are kind of off the charts, well beyond that 4% difference. So after one day of testing, we thought something must have been wrong today. Let's do this again in a few days and see what comes of it. And it was a little bit lower, but still way above 4% again. We did a third day. So after 3 days, we just averaged all of those together and decided this is the next amazing shoe. And around that time is when research and footwear companies started calling them advanced footwear technology rather than super shoes. AFT is a common abbreviation that you'll see if you start looking up articles, journal articles about these types of shoes. So this is the final release, or first release, of that Supershoe. And the differences that we're seeing now have been really effective person by person. We've avoided testing between companies because we don't really want to know. We have a lot of athletes around here in Utah that are racing for various companies. And if we test Saucony against Adidas or Asics or New Balance or Nike and learn one seems to be better than the other, that's not going to be good for whichever athlete sponsored by the other company. But then in a year, that company might develop something that's even better than the one. So we're not in the business of trying to figure out whose company is best, but we do have a lot of research that we've been doing on what foam is the most effective and what shape of shoe and how stiff the plate should be. So let's take a look at some of those results that we've looked at. This one comes from our first Vaporfly study, where we found the effectiveness of the shoes, and you can see on the left axis, the percent benefit of these shoes ranges anywhere from 0 to 6.2 from the data that we measured. And on the x-axis, you can see that we have the amount of time the foot spends on the ground. Everyone was running at the same speed in this study, and there's a weak but trend showing there where the slope was statistically significant, telling us that there is a greater benefit to the runners that spend a bit less time on the ground. I believe that's related to the storing and releasing of energy inside the shoe, where you compress the foam and it wants to push back. And if you're coming off the ground a little sooner, maybe it's pushing back a bit more effectively. We measured a lot of other variables for this test, running mechanics variables, and none of those showed up as significant of predicting how much of a benefit somebody gets from these shoes. There's a lot of ongoing research in this area that's not conclusive yet, so it's a little hard to say which variables are going to matter most. We took a look with one of my grad students, Aubrey McLeod. She was able to create some carbon fiber plates of various stiffnesses. She used anywhere from 2 layers of carbon fiber up to 6 layers of carbon fiber and a shoe with no carbon fiber in it. We were able to get the shoes molded so that we could put the outsole over the plate between the midsole. And the midsole was cut out just a little bit to fit the plate inside there so it wouldn't be glued on with some extra pressure trying to push the outsole off. And as we went through this one, we found that there was an optimal stiffness. Here we did 2 different speeds, so you see both of those plotted there, and you can see around 3 or 4 layers of carbon fiber seemed to be what was optimal for the runners that or this runner as an example. When we looked to everybody, we found there was typically somewhere around a 1.5% benefit by having the shoes be stiffer with carbon fiber, but it was pretty small, and it wasn't the same outcome for everyone. It wasn't always 3 or 4 layers of carbon fiber. So it seems to be very individual and only a small component of what makes these shoes effective. Some people are saying the plates are acting like springs and it shouldn't be allowed because the rule book doesn't allow springs, but they're not working as springs in a way that's really beneficial to propelling the runner off the ground. I feel like the main benefit of this plate, which kind of curves through the shoe, is that it holds this low density soft foam together. Without the plate in there, it's really wobbly and you feel like you're not in very good control of hitting the ground and coming off. So I think the main benefit for the plate is just to give some integrity to that foam. And then there may be some small advantage where that stiffness has a mechanical advantage difference, pushing that center of pressure forward as you come off the ground. So a small piece of it seems to be the plate. When Jared did the New York Marathon, there's a few bridges to go over where you're going uphill and then downhill on the other side. They're fairly long, some of them. And he declared that he felt like he wasn't getting as much of a benefit when he was going uphill, and they felt amazing as he was going downhill. So we did a study looking at uphill, level, and downhill running, and found the data that you see here shows there was no difference between those three conditions in terms of the energy cost of running. Everyone was getting a benefit, but it wasn't better or worse uphill or downhill. So even though he felt that way, on average anyway, it seems that there's not really a difference in those conditions between the types of super shoe footwear versus more traditional ones. So how much faster will you be? It seems around 1 or 2% for race times. So the 4% benefit or more or less than that, whatever it might be for the shoe condition that you're using, doesn't just translate to being 4% better. These two studies I've highlighted here get into some methods to try to determine how much of a benefit there would be, and that seems to be about it. Now, the shoes are still being developed since those studies, so there may be some greater benefits coming compared to the traditional shoes from years ago, but small benefits based on using today's shoes as the new standard. Now, we got curious about extended running. If we run for an hour, so we did a project where we were able to find runners that were willing to go for an hour twice for us, once in an AFT or Supershoe, and another day where they did it in a traditional racing shoe. And the plot on the right, you can see the data points. Every 10 seconds, there was an average of oxygen uptake breaths. And you can see the control shoe in blue. That slope is a bit steeper on this subject. Most of our subjects had this trend where the control shoe increased in oxygen uptake at a higher rate than the AFT. So what we learned is if there's a 4% benefit when you're in the rested state, which is what all the previous studies had done, that benefit is likely to grow as the run progresses. We're not sure exactly why yet. There's a lot of physiological reasons to consider. There's thoughts of muscle damage as we get fatigued. One of the measures we included in this study was some jump testing where we measured the vertical impulse in the takeoff of a jump. It was actually a drop jump. So they dropped off a small platform onto a plate and jumped up. And we found that the detriment to jump height or jump impulse post-run compared to pre-run was greater when they had done their running in the control shoe. So for likely multiple reasons, there's a greater increase in the energy cost of running when wearing a control shoe compared to a super shoe. So throughout the long run, there's going to be some really good benefits in these newer types of shoes. This one is currently in its final part of review, so hopefully this will be published soon. You can take a look at the complete paper in a few weeks. Now, muscle activity. We wondered, where is the benefit coming from in terms of what's happening inside the body? So we put electromyography electrodes on various muscles of the body. You can see the ones that we chose here. And the significant differences where there were decreases in energy or in muscle activity came from the gastrocnemius and soleus. The other muscles, there was no significant difference between the two types of shoes. So initially with this study, it seems it's the muscles around the ankle that are making the difference of where the energy cost is being saved. So less of a push-off needed around the plantar flexors. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in this area to confirm that's really what's going on, but at least our initial study on muscle activity shows those two muscles are the main ones that are getting some muscle activity savings. The final question is recovery. Recovery to runners is very important, so important that this image here, we have an American record holder in the marathon and half marathon After our long run on a Saturday, our friend Scotty was there with his massage table. He's a physical therapist that runs with us and treats us. He brought his equipment to the parking lot. So we finished our run and focused on recovery. In terms of footwear, you might find that when you train in what we call the Supershoe, there's less muscle damage going on. There's a couple studies out right now, and we're in the middle of a data collection right now doing some blood work to check the proteins in the blood for muscle damage and cartilage and tendon changes and red blood cells being damaged through running. So a lot of different areas we're looking at to see what's going on with the body in terms of damage to it when we train in super shoes compared to others. Now, it's hard to say what we should do with the results there. If we find the super shoes are protective of our bodies and our muscles and so on, then we might not be getting as good of a training effect when using them. But if we have a little bit of injury, it might be good to maintain our pace instead of going harder in them, and we get a little more of protection of the feet feet and other parts of the body, and so that could be a good thing. So hard to say, depends maybe on the exact situation of what's going on with each person, but the initial studies are indicating there are some protective mechanisms that come from wearing these shoes, whether it's in racing or training. Muscle power after a run. There's multiple studies now that seem to be showing we do have muscles that are working a little bit more effectively, matching with the last slide that I shared with you about how our bodies are getting really effective at being protected through the wearing of AFT. So what goes on from here? The rule book actually changed once the super shoes came out, and a lot of records were starting to be broken. I think actually every world record on the road from 5K up through marathon, men and women, has been broken at this point compared to pre-2017. So the rule books have declared, here's exactly what a shoe is. They don't allow it to go over 40 millimeters in that stack height under the heel. There's only allowed to be one stiff plate, doesn't matter if it's carbon fiber or something else, but only one, unless if you do have two, they don't overlap anywhere. So you can stiffen up a shoe with basically one plate or something similar, and the stack height is limited, and on the track even more limited, depending on which race distance. There's a lot less thickness allowed for track racing, because we do have now what we call super spikes coming onto the scene also, and we're seeing all kinds of track world records being broken also. So the super shoe is here to stay, but they've got to stay within this scope of what the new rule book will allow. And there'll be shoe companies still trying to improve the foams and change the shape a little bit and adjust the masses of the shoes somehow by modifying the upper and the lower parts of the shoe, trying to just figure out within the rules, how can we still make these a little bit better and faster and energy saving. So the new style of running shoes have a lot of benefits. Here's just 6 that I just pulled out of some of the common companies and what the latest shoes that they have are, but every year something different is coming out. The variation in the benefit seems to be anywhere from 0 to 6% based upon comparing to traditional shoes from the mid 2015 or so, somewhere in there. And there are various factors that determine how much of a benefit somebody will get. And there's a lot of research going on trying to figure out which of those factors are most influential, which ones can be modified to find some further improvements. And as we continue from there, we don't know what will happen with world records, but if we go back to when records were being documented, we've had all kinds of changes in terms of training methods, footwear, nutrition, sports psychology, surfaces of running, if we talk about the track. And there's always some improvements coming on in performance based upon the modifications. But at least at this point, we have clearly defined in the rule book what a shoe is. So hopefully it's more focused on what can the athlete do in terms of sports psychology, training, nutrition, and other areas like that to get continued improvement.